Now, David, I've done my best to recreate the New York studio here in the remote location. And a lot of the things we're going to be doing today are essentially an experiment. How are you today, David?
I'm
Uh-oh.
very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
There we go. Okay. I hope we don't have that much of a delay throughout the show, but we're definitely dealing with much slower internet than we usually have. And I think it's going to be all right. David, I wanted to remind our viewers who perhaps weren't watching on Wednesday that you had a really fantastic appearance on Charles Ortella's Closing In, where you basically showed up, schooled a former CIA analyst about the patent that Dominion Voting Systems has on electronic correction of voter-marked paper ballots. And I thought it was a brilliant appearance. People can go back and check out this week's episode of Charles Ortella's Closing In. It was the F Team. Anything you want to say about that briefly before we get into today's program, David?
Well, actually, it's very relevant because just the term or the title of the patent, electronic correction of the voter-marked paper ballot, should put the hairs in the collective neck of Americans up. I mean, it's quite obvious that they built into that system, it's a Dominion voting patent, a back door that can electronically and remotely correct the votes. So if the artificial intelligence, which I'm confident is embedded in that system, detects votes going for someone they don't want elected, well, they just switch the votes to someone else, and a new paper ballot is produced that is identical in all forms, marks, scratches, and dots, except that the particular, I don't know if you call it the bubble, which had showed one candidate, is now switched to another candidate. Now, what
Right.
happens to the original paper ballot, I don't know. For all I know, there could be a shredder in the bottom of the machine.
Hmm.
But that new optical readout, so there is a totally legitimate concern from American voters that Dominion voting, not necessarily maliciously, has left a backdoor in the system that would allow the remote or central server, as is referred to in the patent 29 times, where the word security occurs once, that a central server could, with artificial intelligence, adjust the votes. So it would be a very good reason to come outside the Capitol building on January the 6th and make a protest over to you.
Well, just to clarify, David, is it necessarily a back door? Because it seems to me that just in the language of the patent, they're describing potential set of circumstances by which it's the front door, it's the artificial intelligence that can correct these ballots. The question that weighs in my mind after viewing this abstract that speaks about methods, systems, and devices described for electronically correcting votes made on voter-marked paper ballots is exactly how many times were those circumstances met such that this artificial intelligence technology that's patented here would be invoked. We don't really know because so much effort has been expended in telling us all how there is no evidence that there was vote tampering, so therefore there's going to be no audit and no investigation of it. But frankly, just this very patent raises the question that this function of the software, no hack, no Chinese, Iranian, Venezuelan interference, it's just the operation of this software that is in question.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think while you were talking, it suddenly occurred to me, and it occurred to you, obviously, it's the front door into the system, right? So that you can remotely and electronically correct the votes in the system. And that takes me to and we can perhaps talk about that at another time during the show, but the Cameron Ortis thesis of compromised nodes, because a compromised node would be one where you could get into that central server and signal to various Dominion voting machines that the votes needed to be corrected to secure the result desired by perhaps the artificial intelligence that had picked up a trend that it didn't like. Over to you.
Right. And then for people who perhaps aren't familiar with Dr. Ortis, I want to make sure they are up to speed here. Cameron Ortis is the former civilian director of intelligence from the RCMP who's been arrested. He's accused of espionage, and we've spoken many times about this PhD thesis that he wrote over there at the University of British Columbia, describing compromised nodes in cybersecurity in East Asia. How is this relevant?
Well, this was a thesis written in 2006, and he had a stellar career. He was obviously very bright. He was described as the smartest guy in the room. And then he was fast-tracked through the RCMP, and he got to be the first civilian director general of the RCMP intelligence service. And presumably, continuing on from his PhD thesis at UBC, he discovered some compromised nodes that presumably scared him. But the essence of these people, the compromised node, I believe, and we can talk about the mechanics of setting up a compromised node, has been set up apparently within the RCMP and all of the organizations that raided Starnet on August of 1999. But more to the point, if this gentleman gets to be the Director General of the RCMP and finds compromised nodes within the RCMP, what the hell is he going to do? Well, apparently he installed 30 computers at his home, presumably because he didn't feel safe to do the research into the compromised nodes in East Asian cybersecurity at the office. And it would appear then, and we've been following this argument now for a long time, Justin Trudeau and perhaps Bob Paulson, then the RCMP commissioner who fast-tracked this guy into the position in the RCMP, realized that the compromised nodes that Dr. Ortis was discovering were nodes compromised by Justin Trudeau. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, that aspect is speculation that we're making right now based on the evidence that we've seen, but there is a lot of really strange evidence surrounding this Cameron Ortis case, and I'm trying to find a picture of Justin Trudeau with Bob Paulson. You would think the director of the RCMP would be pictured with the guy. I can't find that right now very easily. Paulson's been replaced by, I think, the first female, is that right? The first female director?
Yes.
Yeah, see.
Now, on my screen, Jason, if you don't mind, the big picture is just you and it's not moving. Am I patched into the
You're
Google,
still good.
or just...
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I think you're just...
Okay.
I think you're just experiencing some of the strange anomalies of this remote system. We're still trying to work out some of the details, David, but what I've got right here for everybody to see is this new director of the RCMP, who is a woman. This is the first woman to be the director of the RCMP, right?
Yeah, and just to repeat, sorry, why don't I see her on this screen of mine, or is that just a quirk of the setup?
That's something to do with the way Zoom is going on your computer, or perhaps, oh yes, it looks like the feed to you has died. I'll have to troubleshoot that after, David. Let me real quick try and address that.
All right, okay. So just to carry on, yes, her name is Beverly. I can't remember the surname. But anyway, this is a scandal that was raised the security risk from high to severe. And for me, not...
That was a big mistake. Now we've lost your audio. Trying to bring back. Hang on. Oh boy. I should have just left that be. Hang on, David. We've lost your audio. That's terrible. Let me see. How about... Okay, wait a second. Sorry, David. Stay with me a second. Stand by, everybody. See, we leave the studio in New York, and all kinds of things happen. We're going to have it back right here. David, I think we've got you back.
1, 2, 3?
Yes. Okay. You were saying?
Good. Yeah, so that woman's name is Beverly, right? I don't remember the surname. So I think she took over from Bob Paulson, right? Mm-hmm. But the RCMP should be in total disarray and contemplating its own entrails, because there's been a collapse in security in the RCMP to the point where they're accusing the former Director General of leaking top secret information that threatens the very survival of Canada to Canada's enemy. Right, Beverly Ann Buzzer. I much prefer to think there's an explanation that is, oh, I didn't realize she's an alumna of the University of British Columbia. Well, that's important. because yes, because I believe alumni, I and AE of the University of British Columbia played a major role in the attack of 911 and attacks going back, including the operation of Child Base and the raid on Starnet. But perhaps I'm digressing. The point about Dr. Ortis is he's in jail, and if whatever he's supposed to have done is a severe risk to Canada's survival or existence in the Five Eyes countries, he needs to be out of jail, side by side with the guy who probably put him in jail, which is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. So he and Justin Trudeau can tell Parliament or the public itself why the hell he's in jail, and can Justin Trudeau prove that this man is lawfully detained? Because I think he's an agent, or potentially an agent for the good side, that discovered something so deep and horrible within the Canadian, and for that matter, American intelligence networks, that he's been put in jail and probably or may never emerge again to see the light. Over to you.
I hope that's not the case. And, you know, David, we've got to admit it was a little bit of time before we started to put that together. When we first heard about Cameron Ortis, you and I were shocked he was involved with this investigation into Phantom Secure. He's actually been accused, if I'm not mistaken, of illicitly sharing information with Phantom Secure that would have gone to some of the worst international criminal organizations in the world. And for people who haven't seen the show before or don't recall, Phantom Secure was a company based in Canada. Give us a little background on Phantom Secure, if you could, David.
I'm sorry?
Can you hear me? If you could just give us some background on Phantom Secure. I think we've got
Jason.
some people joining us who haven't seen some of the previous shows. Phantom Secure, of
Yes,
course,
okay,
was...
so these are modified Blackberries, apparently, that provide security amongst the team. That I believe they sold about 20,000 modified Blackberries, 10,000 in Australia. And this was allowed criminal groups, or the senior people in criminal groups, to communicate with with each other in total security and facilitate murders and drug smuggling. I'm just reading for there, 20,000 users. Now, more than 250 agents searched 25 properties in 3 countries. But the question to ask about all of these things is, did they actually dismantle the network, or did they move it somewhere else, or did they change the technology? So I think what Cameron Ortis was doing, he was tracking down a network of compromised nodes that connected criminal groups around the world, not just in East Asia, in the UK, the United States, and in Canada. And I think he discovered that this organization was capable of, let's say, staging an event like, I don't know, the Las Vegas shootings, in conjunction with social networks that had been set up by, let's say, Justin Trudeau.
Well, David, how about the Capitol riot? Wasn't that an event set up in social networks?
Absolutely. Maybe that's a good time to go on to the Capitol riot, which is the subject of our show today. So the Capitol riot, there are experts out there, probably far better informed than I think a man called Kilcullen. But I and you, I think, have been discussing the possibility that the January 6th event was the first salvo in a color revolution to overthrow the government of the United States. And I believe that we now have substantial evidence that the events of January the 6th were directed by the BBC and delivered by this British outsourcing company, Serco. Now, what do I mean when I say the BBC might have directed the Capitol Hill riots of January the 6th? Most people may know, certainly the people who listen to us, that the BBC is the world's leading broadcaster of news, entertainment, and propaganda. And he's been working, particularly in times of warfare, but maybe even more diligently in times of social revolution, on the development of real-time parallel narratives, where one narrative is fed to the public and the other narrative is fed to the actors, let's say, on Capitol Hill. And the technology is always fascinating, because you and I now have a great deal, I think, of expertise in going around the patents and seeing if the patents that might explain this. We have a patent that I discovered, let's say, 18 months or 2 years ago, that was taken out, I think, on August the 3rd, 1998, which is a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. And I've thought long and hard about, and you and I have discussed, what kind of television signals it might generate. And I think they could be described as digital blocking notes in the, not in the 19th and 18th century, and I suppose in theaters today. And when I was an actor in our local community theater, we had blocking notes where the producer would tell us where we were supposed to be when we were talking lines. Well, this guy, David Grossman, it's an absolutely pathetic description of what happened on Capitol Hill on January the 6th, where the man says Trump supporters invaded the Capitol building.
Yeah.
Right? And
well,
if
you
you look
just
at the
so
crowd,
dramatic.
and you were down in Washington.
Sorry to interrupt, David, but it's so dramatic, this guy's whole presentation. And I was searching for the patent. I'm on a new system here, and I don't have all our patents loaded. I apologize, I gotta get that loaded. But yeah, the guy appears to be acting, and he almost seems to be nervously flubbing the lines.
Well, he's, I believe, reading from the modern equivalent of a spoken text display apparatus patented by the BBC, that is, perhaps without his knowledge, is sending an AI set of orders to the various people that need to be in a position on the Capitol Hill to convey the effect or the impression to the public at large that Donald Trump has ordered these people to invade the Capitol building. Right? And it's quite persuasive. Now, at 017 in that patent, I hear cleared the set, but you hear clear the steps. Are you sure? Are you right, or am I right?
I think he said clear the steps, because they show the steps in the video. I mean, we're playing with fire to even show the video portion of this BBC clip. They can strike it on YouTube. Now, legally speaking, it is fair use, but it takes us to yet another interesting point, David. I'm sorry to, be a little ADD on you here, but one of the actors in this whole thing that could have been receiving blocking notes or whatever, this guy, John Sullivan, who's pictured in our collage today. I don't know if you were aware of this, David, but it's been revealed that CNN and NBC have paid this dope $35,000 each for access to his footage. Now, this guy is a real domestic terrorist. He's inside the Capitol instructing people to, burn the place down and cheering about how we did this together. And his own brother called the FBI and said that he was leading the riot. So CNN and NBC have no problem paying this guy. I'm sure he's using the 70 grand to pay off his lawyers, because he's been charged with serious crimes. But yet the narrative has not moved off of this idea that Donald Trump incited the riot and this guy's just a journalist.
So let's just back up to the relationship, because what I said a little earlier was that the BBC directed the riot or scripted the riot as what they intended or wanted to happen. Or put it another way, what they wanted the public to perceive was happening on Capitol Hill. And Serco delivered in that last mile. If you put a dot in the middle of the Capitol building and drew a mile radius around it, you would reach a lot of interesting people, some of whom might be very interested at getting paid off to act in a live action role play on the steps of the Capitol building and invade the Capitol, and put on whatever uniform is desired to convince the public at large that they were directed by Donald Trump. So I think with these kind of events, double narrative events, there's two kinds of guerrillas or terrorists necessary to pull this kind of thing off. There's what I call the expert guerrillas that have the technology that would allow them to communicate securely with different people in the crowd. Right? That kind of classical thing would be, I would say, the Motorola radios. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because I don't know I haven't seen that image before. Interesting. That image that I showed you of someone with what looks like a Motorola radio, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, has equipped the army with the modern Motorola radio, and it looks very, yeah. Now, this guy is egging the crowd on. I presume he's not working with the United States Army, but maybe experts can look at his radio system. But can you zoom in? Can you detect who made that thing? But it looks very much like a Motorola radio of the type. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I can't zoom any further than that, unfortunately.
Sorry, I missed. Okay, all right. And if you look at the US Army Motorola radio, it looks very similar. But either way, if these people were communicating within the United States Army through a compromised node, it's very possible that Cameron Ortis had recognized that the US military had been infiltrated by compromised nodes, where the compromised nodes were connected to the kind of people that you would need to be in Capitol Hill to present an image that this was a spontaneously, well, no, not a spontaneously operation. It was actually driven by Donald Trump. And basically then say, well, Trump is unelectable, etc. Over to you.
Well, it's an interesting bit of speculation, David, but I think there's some more things that we can glean just from looking at some of these images and some more connections that are interesting and troubling, to say the least. You know, the Motorola radios, it's hard to say because I think Motorola is essentially the Scotch tape of radios. And if you were using radios, I don't know that having the same radio necessarily draws a direct connection. Something a bit more obscure and quite interesting is this pendant hanging around the guy's neck. It appears to be Thor's hammer. And what's interesting is that the Grand Poobah, what was this guy's name? The shaman with the helmet and the horns, he has a tattoo of Thor's hammer right on his stomach. So, I mean, before this January 6th riot, I had only ever seen Thor's hammer in Avengers movies. Why do these two guys who are attacking the Capitol, why are they so closely affiliated with Thor's hammer? And with regard to the BlackBerries being hacked, you know, David, before you and I started doing our regular show, years ago at this point, I did shows with this guy who people will recall named George, who was very big on these hacked BlackBerries. David, he was right at the Capitol, right there when the riot began. I mean, I was at the Capitol too, but I was in the back just looking at it. It took me sort of a long time to realize what was going on. We were watching from afar and just sort of observing. I was not positioned at the tip of the spear in the way that John Sullivan was, or even in the way that George Webb was. And it's just curious to me that these guys, you know, I went to the port of Charleston the other day in South Carolina, maybe last week. I later learned that George had been there just the day before. And as you're well aware, there's a whole issue with a broadcast that we did about the port of Charleston in 2017, information that was brought to me by George and his associates that other people who are related to him and have done work with him have spent the past 4 years trying to pin on me. And it seems to me, David, these are all false narratives. And just in the way that the BBC is trying to convince everyone that Donald Trump incited this riot, fomented this violence at the Capitol, it seems like the same style of false narrative that's been used against me, where news is generated. You know, Vice News did a story even just last month that showed video from this channel, made a point of saying that the title of that video was "The Calm Before the Storm," and that this is a phrase that's somehow linked to the 17th letter of the alphabet. The dope in the Chewbacca outfit is a QAnon shaman. So now that I've said that, we'll get a little Wikipedia notice on the bottom of this video. But the point is, all of these things seem related to me, David.
Well, absolutely. So I think now it's very important to understand, well, the terminology of revolutionary guerrilla organization. I first heard those three words together when I was looking at Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he has his senior thesis at Princeton in 1980, very important, a critical analysis of revolutionary guerrilla organization in theory and practice. Well, that worries the sixth. So is he, because of his training and his expertise, able to recognize the first salvo in a color revolution from a revolutionary guerrilla organization and prevent it? I mean, basically, on whose side is he on? Well, let me back up here. In order to pull this off on the scale that was done on January the 6th, as I said, you need two kinds of organizations. One is an organization that has expert in all of the military grade or police grade communication systems needed to coordinate an infiltration of what was otherwise, let's say, a peaceful protest about the election. And then, possibly even more important, particularly because it leaves clues, you need an organization that is within, I would allege, the last mile of the event, you know, a mile around the radius of the Capitol building, where there are people there who are in what the RCMP would call a virtual floating matrix. That is to say, they've all got day jobs, but when they get a message, right, go down to the Capitol, go inside, dress like this, basically there's a listen and obey concept coming through. And as we know, the mantra of the BBC and its propaganda arm, embedded in those statues or carvings that we saw outside Broadcasting House when we were there in January of last year, the absculta, which is the first word of the Benedictine Creed, is listen and obey. So now the mechanism that Americans and everyone in the Five Eyes countries and maybe around the free world is, how does the BBC create a grassroots or guerrilla organization in the vicinity of a major crime scene, like the mosque in Christchurch, or the burning of the roof of the Notre Dame, or the London Underground bombing, or the murder of the Shermans in Toronto, or John Benet Ramsey? How do they create and control a local group within that last mile, if you will, of the crime scene, such that when that group or any individuals in it get the message, they go and do exactly what they're told, no more, no less, and then go back to their day jobs? That is the ultimate, to me, what the RCMP referred to as the virtual floating matrix, somewhere around the year 2000. Now, I think Cameron Ortis had recognized that organization, and I think I have now. So maybe I could just share with you what I think has been happening since 1988. And you use the word with George. There's a family of people around George that seem to be operating in this manner. So I think what's happened is that Pierre Trudeau and his son Justin, Pierre died in 2000, and Bill Clinton and Kamala Harris put together three ostensibly independent networks that would allow almost total control over families that had been divided against themselves. In the Canada, we have the Family Maintenance and Enforcement Program that was set up in 1988 by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Attorney General of BC at the time, a guy called Bud Smith, right, who resigned into, I'm sorry? Pierre Trudeau, yes, 1988. Yeah. And incidentally, just to give you a time frame on that, Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister for the second time in 1980, which was the same year that General Mark Milley, wrote his senior thesis, I think, a critical analysis of revolutionary guerrilla organizations in theory and practice. Now, Pierre Trudeau was a traitor on a scale I don't think most Canadians could even consider. But essentially, he was a great fan of some of the greatest killers in the world, in particular, Mao Zedong, who wrote a book on guerrilla warfare. I think in 1937 it was published. And Pierre Trudeau visited, I think, China in 1960, and then again in 1970. And there's a picture of him shaking hands with Mao Zedong, probably the greatest mass murder of the 20th century. So I think these people, with Pierre Trudeau's background, where he'd been run out of reserve officer training school or college in Montreal at the Second World War. He did a grand tour of the Harvard, the Sorbonne, and the London School of Economics. He comes back to Canada, takes a senior position in the Privy Council, and I believe introduced the notion of guerrilla or Fabian warfare to Canada or Canadians without them actually realizing what was going on here. Now, in the case of the States, 1998, 10 years after the introduction of FMEP in Canada, Bill Clinton introduced the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act. And the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, together with the 3 strikes and you're out practice introduced by Bill Clinton and Kamala Harris in California, if you put those 3 organizations together, you can basically extort a family through prisoner's dilemma, where essentially the father is put in isolation from the children and pay out child support payments. And I'm not saying they're not necessary. The woman or the mother may be told, well, you're going to lose your welfare or your child support payments unless you do exactly what you're told in respect of some of the organizations directed by Justin Trudeau's roommate, which was an international pedophile ring. So I'm going around and around a bit, but essentially, I think this color revolution is based on the destruction of the family, isolating fathers from children, basically putting the mother's welfare and the children's welfare in a box, right, where actually everyone is suffering. And you end up by what did Karl Marx say, the abolition of marriage, even the most radical flare up at the infamous suggestion of the communists. What the Communist Party, the Chinese, the Trudeaus, and Bill Clinton and Kamala Harris they've fractured, perhaps irredeemably, the value of family and family values in the United States and Canada. Over to you.
Well, David, as you're telling us about this, it occurs to me that to the extent that the citizens of the United States are a form of family, we're all one country, we've been isolated from one another. I mean, many people haven't seen their family for a year. People who can't travel and maybe don't want to get contact traced and things shoved up their nose and untested vaccines are limited where they can go. Can you still hear me?
Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Now, so let's go back to the BBC fomenting the breakup of the family such that it is now more vulnerable to a color revolution because people have stopped picking up clues, willing suspension of disbelief from within the family. You've got isolation of grandparents and grandchildren, right? I would say that probably the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act covers 1 million to 2 million families in the United States. And those people are vulnerable to payoff controls from Serco, because Serco is this extraordinary company that can assemble a group of prisoners or parolees, fly them down into the area of the Capitol building to carry out the communications that put a rogue crew inside the Capitol building, and then recruit people after the event to spin the story around the idea that it's Trump. So essentially, you've got a deadbeat payoff system operating that can assemble a crowd of people, for example, in FBI uniforms on the Pentagon lawn immediately after whatever it was impacted the Pentagon. You can have a crowd of people picking up debris and evidence at ground zero. You can have a group of police arriving in Toronto at the home of Barry and Honey Sherman and not noticing that their wrists have been tied with plastic handcuffs, right? The home of John Benet Ramsey, who don't notice or choose not to notice that she's been tasered just below the ear and in the belly, and tasers at that time. So I'm talking about a last mile supply chain, where Serco is probably the world authority on this because they've been delivering SWAT teams, special weapons and tactics teams, into some fairly hostile areas right back to World War II with project when it was called RCAGB. So Serco, or RCAGB 1929, and the BBC are in a position to produce a script running into an event like 911, right, and control the crime scene investigation afterwards by parachuting or moving in people who are actually living, resident, and working in the area. So you have an extraordinary, powerful surveillance operation on the crime scene that endures to this day. That is to say, families living in the area, they know something, but they're not talking about it, as to what happened on the Pentagon lawn. And if I may just talk about, you remember when you and I went up to Dominion Road in British Columbia, and we were inquiring into the missing women, the Picton pig farm, and you and I were amazed because we asked one woman who said she didn't want to talk about it, right? We were right by the barn, or the barn had been pulled down. And then someone pedals along on a bike, and it turns out to be a former Vancouver police detective, if I remember correctly, who had been investigating Starnet. Now, what are the odds of that happening? Is it not possible that we had been surveilled, because remember, McDonnell Deptweiler has a satellite image that can pick out a number plate, right, up there, that you, because you've got a very high profile, you wander around, with me, and wouldn't they, from a counterintelligence point of view, to protect the conspiracy or the color revolution, need to know, do you and I present a threat to the conspiracy? So they send a guy around to find out what we know and what we don't know. And I don't know what they concluded, but I think we've moved a hell of a long way from that guy showing up. But I think every crime scene of note, including the Las Vegas shooting, is being surveilled by people who are members of the deadbeat payoff team controlled by Serco. So if you draw a mile around, what was the name of the hotel? The MGM Mandalay Bay Hotel?
Yeah.
How many people would you guess lived in a mile radius around there? And why wouldn't they be
an apartment
paid?
building,
let's say they're part
right
of
down the street. There's an apartment building called like the Sky Apartments or something. I parked my car there.
Right. So as I say, I think Americans must come to terms with they have seen on January the 6th the first salvo of what apparently is called a color revolution. That guy Kilcullen talks about that. I wasn't very familiar with that term, but I looked up color revolution in Wikipedia, and you have purple revolutions and you have pink revolutions and so on, going back decades. But the general formula is you put together a group of guerrilla embedded within the society, one group that has the special expertise to operate as a SWAT team, with the special weapons to blow up the buildings, but another group that in many ways is more important to massage evidence at the crime scene, right? And then present, maybe through interviews with people like David Grossman, a narrative that the BBC wants people to believe, that it was Trump that sent that crowd into the Capitol building. So if we can start taking apart a crime scene in two separate ways, one is who put together the script that sent the weapons, the special weapon tactics in, and who put together the script that allows the public to perceive that crime scene in a certain way consistent with what the BBC inner party wants them to see. Over to you.
Yeah. And boy, there was so much that I wanted to say. It's hard to keep it in my head while you're going on there. Oh, yes. So along the lines, I've been looking for that brochure for the gold standard where Serco talks about these training exercises and resiliency exercises that they create where they borrow government networks and even increase the realism of the simulation by using real journalists and media plays and things like this. So I couldn't find this video either, and I apologize. I got to build up my library of media that I have in the New York office on this portable system. But I remember on January 7th or 8th, right after the incident, there was an interview with a guy right outside the Capitol building who said some things that didn't quite exactly comport to what I had seen in this real Jaden X video, which is John Sullivan's own video that he was paid over $70,000 for. Canadian News also paid him $2,500. It's interesting that it's so low. You know, David, when Fox News used my clip on Tucker Carlson of me interviewing Alan Dershowitz about his idiotic opinion related to the government's right to force you to take experimental medical procedures, they didn't offer me any money, they just took it. And I didn't take any action because I don't think it would be actionable. The video is out there on YouTube and it's newsworthy, and if they're going to show it on their news show and make commentary on it, yes, that can get a strike on YouTube, but under the strictest sense of copyright law, it's fair use, it's newsworthy. I don't think they really needed to pay this kid, John Sullivan, 70 grand. I don't know why they would do that. It's also noteworthy that he was with a documentarian who works for CNN or is creating some kind of documentary for CNN. So that's weird that he's got all these connections to CNN. But back to the concept of news and media plays, one of the guys that's in that group when Ashley Babbitt, the Air Force veteran, is allegedly shot by some unknown person in the Capitol building. Remember, when George Floyd was killed, we knew all the officers' names right away. When that guy, forgive me for forgetting his name, but there was somebody in the Wendy's passed out in his car drunk days after the George Floyd. You know, we knew all about those officers. Seems whenever there's a shooting in the public, we hear the officer's name. But oddly, this Ashley Babbitt shooting, we have no idea who the guy was. Lots of questions. Somebody has made a video asking questions about that. But one of the people who was in the immediate vicinity with John Sullivan is then interviewed by major news media right outside as if he was waiting there to start spinning the story the moment it happened, to implant in viewers' minds around the world and through the BBC that Donald Trump sent everybody in there, not John Sullivan.
Right. So back to, I think, this dichotomy between, and particularly as it relates to the last mile. And remember, the title that we have is that this is the last mile for Kamala Harris's journey to the White House, where if she did make that journey, other than I think her home at the moment is the Observatory House somewhere in the vicinity of the White House. That's where traditionally the vice presidents live.
Yep.
But I believe that Kamala Harris has actually been groomed back to her time at grade school in Montreal to become the 47th president of the United States and head up what I would describe now, I suppose, with this terminology, a color revolution. Now let's look at her role in the 90s. So she becomes a prosecutor in California and an avid practitioner, I believe, of the 3 strikes and you're out rule, together with Bill Clinton, who added, I believe, to the federal prison population from 74,000 to 240,000, primarily as a result of the 3 strike rules application. Now, what have you got with that? You've got a whole community, many of them poor black men, that have been isolated from their families and punished. And the 3 strikes and you're out rule could work 2 ways. One is if you're in prison and you don't do what you're told, or you do what you're told in order to do, maybe assault a fellow prisoner, you can get out on parole to go and do, I don't know, murder John Benet Ramsey or kill the Shermans in Toronto. So what these people have done, Kamala Harris and Bill Clinton in the United States, through the operation of the Deadbeat Parent Punishment Act, what an amazing wording for a country like the Republic, where freedom and honor and integrity are supposedly valued, to identify anyone who falls behind with the child support payment to be a deadbeat without the context. Maybe they've had a mental breakdown, maybe they're out of a job. But ultimately, if you put the 3 strikes and the Deadbeat Parent Punishment Act together, you have, I believe, the basis for a revolutionary guerrilla organization that hates America and everything it stands for, that can stand by, using the words of the RCMP, as a virtual floating matrix. And when they're called upon to go and plant a story outside the Capitol building, and they're given a script to read, they do it without a question. And then they return to their day jobs. Right? Mm. So this is really insidious. And I think the people who designed this way back was Pierre Trudeau, who was a Fabian, an admirer of every bloodthirsty communist you could imagine, dictator, including Castro and Mao Zedong. He was in Moscow in 1952, leading the Canadian Communist Party delegation, and in 1969, followed by Bill Clinton. So these people, going back to the story with the artificial intelligence, tracking characters to understand narratives, I think you and I now, with our listeners, are quite good at tracking narratives to understand characters. And if we assumed that this was a color revolution on January the 6th, wouldn't it be interesting to track the character of Kamala Harris and to see how close she now is on that last mile to the White House? Because if, God forbid, an accident should happen to Joe Biden, doesn't she become the 47th president of the United States? Over to you.
Absolutely. Anything that would incapacitate him, health failure. I mean, he seems inches away from that. He's basically oblivious to what's going on. He told Anderson Cooper that he wakes up in the White House wondering where he is. It's a very troubling situation, David. And, we've got just a few minutes left before we make the transition over to our sponsor exclusive show. People are going to be able to enjoy that. We're going to go even more in depth on these and other topics in just about a little more than 10 minutes on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, and subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. And David, it's so important that our viewers sponsor the show, because unlike other shows that get corporate sponsorship and can be influenced by the desires and interests of those corporations, you and I are offering our information exclusively to the viewers. And it's, a lot of people misunderstand the concept of, how this type of sponsorship works. This is actually the best way for news media to be delivered, because we have eliminated any major financial interest from having any influence over what the story might be. I mean, if we were just taking ads, perhaps Serco, BlackRock, or any of these other companies could take out a lot of ads and build up our financial reliance on them, and then start dictating what the news reporting could be. In fact, David, there are some people who come into the comments and try to say, hey, stop talking about this. And I need to remind those people that viewers should not be telling us what we should or should not be covering. If people don't like a particular topic, they're certainly free to tune out. If somebody feels we've said something inaccurate, we always invite input from viewers in the form of evidence-based information. It's less helpful for people to provide their opinions, and much more helpful if anybody has firsthand experience with any of the things that we're talking about, lives near some of these places, worked for some of these companies, is an expert in any of these fields. That sort of information is so helpful. But advice as far as what we should do, what we shouldn't cover, we don't want that. That's the type of advice that pharmaceutical companies give to shows. We've heard from former producers of television shows on CBS and elsewhere that when they wanted to do controversial stories about some of these major corporations, they can't do it because they're such major sponsors of the networks that the higher-ups simply just don't allow it to be done, and people can lose their jobs over this kind of thing. So we're trying to keep this information as right down the middle as we can and avoid that sort of influence. David, we've got just a couple minutes before we make it over to that sponsor exclusive segment. Anything you want to say to wrap up this, or let people know where we'll continue in the next segment?
Well, yes, I'd just like to refer to that business about subscribers joining. We are up against, I believe, an organization that can deploy within the area where Jason is living a whole bunch of people who can pop out of the woodwork and accuse him of doing something, like fomenting a rebellion. So they are very well financed, very well organized. And so we're a relatively small team that I believe is bringing truth. Now, very quickly, I'd just like to say how I believe that Serco distributes payoffs through this control of what's known as iterative prisoner's dilemma. So I've coined an acronym. I think you know it's a MAC4, i.e. there's 4 systems by which they distribute the payoffs to keep the truth out of the public knowledge. That outfit called Maximus, which operates the Family Maintenance Enforcement Program in Canada, and the Deadbeat Parent Punishment Act in the United States. AMEC, because that's the company that was sitting above Starnet and got the contract to remove debris from the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And removing debris is akin to removing evidence, which is a felony, and known as spoliation of evidence. So you have MAC. The C is for Childbase, which is a network for monitoring or tracking the faces associated with international pedophile racket of the kind operated by Justin Trudeau's roommate. And H is for Huawei, because I think you'll find that if we dig a little deeper, the communications technology at the Capitol riot was supplied by Huawei through a backdoor through Motorola. So Huawei is facing a racketeering charge in Brooklyn. So MAC4 to me conveys the mechanism by which Serco distributes the payoff to control what are known in the artificial intelligence community as iterative prisoner dilemma games. Over to you.
And with that, David, we're going to wish everybody a pleasant afternoon. I hope we will see everybody with us for the next segment on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. And for the viewers that are normally watching us on subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, I really would encourage people to check out David's Patreon and Subscribestar pages as well. It's so important that people sponsor the co-hosts. We're really building a great network of super intelligent people, and we couldn't do it without your help. If you've been enjoying the road trip, please become a sponsor. I can't do shows like this without your support and sponsorship. So thanks to everybody out there who is a sponsor, and we hope to see new sponsors with us in less than 10 minutes when the show continues.